Okay, great. Adam, do you want to share the screen a little bit? I thought to give you all a very quick introduction to Fathom and to myself. So I am an architect. I've been an architect for coming up to over 20 years now. My background, I started in the Northeast in Newcastle for a couple of years before coming back down to London to complete my training. I then started off in very small practices of like 5 people, 10 people. Then I worked at Make Architects, which is a much larger scale practice, for about 10 years. In that time, I did lots of R&D labs for Oxford University, and also worked on large heritage commercial schemes in central London on Regent Street and Haymarket for many years. I then joined Fathom when they were about 1 year old, but I worked with the other 2 directors at my previous practice, Make, for quite a while. So we've known each other for coming up to 20 years. Adam, do you want to just flip over to the next couple? So for the people who didn't make it to the previous kind of office tour and down here, I thought we would just show, we originally were concentrating just on the Old Kent Road for the people who came down to visit us and walk around. And we spoke quite a lot about Blackfriars Road, one of our large residential schemes. And what we were hoping to do is talk about Bishop's Terrace and Cleaver Street. We kind of ran out of time. So this will pick up on those 2 projects, basically located in Lambeth. And then I will be moving up north to talk about a slightly different scheme that is more development plan, master planning for STFC up at Daresbury. Do you want to just flip over, Adam, to so this was previously what we were hoping to talk about. We spoke before about Blackfriars Road, our almshouses, and then the 2 schemes at the bottom are the 2 that you're going to hear more about from my colleagues, and then I will keep mine as a little bit of a surprise towards the end. Okay, so Fathom, Adam, if you can just skip forward, was set up about 10 years ago in May, and we set it up to concentrate on what we called complex projects in sensitive sites. So we like to work on things that's slightly tricky, or might be a complicated brief, it might be an interesting client relationship, it could be a heritage building, and it's things that we feel that we need to delve into a little bit more deeper to really unlock that brief, and we do that by collaborating with obviously the wider design team, but also internally we like to pull in specialists as and when we need, and that in overall enables us to create places that we care about, so that are kind of based for their communities, embedded with strong identities, and help create places that connect with the people that are going to use them. Do you want to just hop on to the next slide, Adam? So overall, we work across a range of sectors, Fathom, and a range of scales. So we have a 22-storey commercial tower and residential, which is Blackfriars scheme, which we spoke about in our previous kind of presentation. But we work across residential schemes, heritage, churches, master planning, laboratories, and some of that ranges from all sorts of scales. So huge development plans across large parts of Oxfordshire, to the Pod, which is a small little temporary recording studio. And what we find is this enables us to be quite nimble and respond to different briefs individually. It allows us to kind of be flexible in our approach, and really get to the bottom of what each project needs for their client and for the wider place and the community, and to respond. So we're definitely not, as I would call, say, cookie cutter architects. We really try and create places and buildings that are unique and meet a specific set of requirements. So I'm going to jump straight into our first scheme. So I'm going to pass you over to Adam, who is one of our associates at Fathom, who will be talking about Cleaver Street.
Great, thanks, Vicky. So I'm Adam Clemens. I studied and trained as an architect in South Africa. And then in 2015, I moved over to the UK, and I joined Panther Hudspeth an architectural practice that was also in Southwark, and I worked on that Elephant Park scheme, the sort of brick building that sort of got sort of various forms that sort of jut out and push in. That was sort of the project that I worked on when I first arrived in London, which is really exciting. And then I joined Fathom in 2016, so I've been at Fathom for a little over 9 years now, which feels a little bit like a lifetime. And worked on a sort of variety of projects, one of which is Cleaver Street. So Cleaver Street is the old Lambeth County and Family Court. It was a court until 2017, when the Ministry of Justice consolidated the court functions in Wandsworth. Now, the difficulty with intervening in a building like this is that it's obviously particularly specific to its use. So trying to come up with a different function for a building that has such a specific use is really, really difficult. It is also a Grade 2 listed building, which also just adds to the complexity and the interest of the project. So I think the identity of the building and the project was already there for us, and I think that everything that we our intervention as a result needed to respond to that identity very, very carefully. So yeah, you guys went to Elephant Park the last time you came. We're a little bit further southeast of that at Cleaver Street, a little bit more residential. So you can see this is the court where it sits at the moment. You've got this larger residential block towards the rear, the Kelstock House, and then you've also got another residential block that sits at the front, slightly put on a diagonal, creating this little triangular open space in front of the courtroom, in front of the courthouse, I beg your pardon. Then all around this, you've got sort of terraced housing that creates Cleaver Square, which is really popular amongst local residents. So it's all sort of quite residential and sort of low rise in this area, and then this this courthouse sits as a something in contrast to all of that residential element. So you can get a sense of what I was talking about, the identity of the building. It's all quite clear from the very beginning, these heritage elements that we really look to preserve throughout and really guided the design or guided the proposed design and interventions that we look to make. So you've got this sort of really distinct facade that faces onto Cleaver Street, and then internally inside the courtrooms, you've got this really distinct identities created by this sort of double height spaces in the courtrooms. So you can see a very sort of distinct set of character to the space, and then also in the circulation space, you got this sort of little bit of elaboration, elaborate touches in certain areas of the building. So I think when we went around the building, we really wanted to understand, because we were being forced to change the use of the building, obviously. It was really valuable to try and understand what the key heritage elements were. And so anything that we did do needed to respond and be really considerate to those key heritage elements, and then also identify areas that weren't necessarily as sensitive, where we could have a little bit more intervention. So just jumping to the plan is fairly complicated. So what we've got on the ground floor is we're proposing turning the ground floor into a commercial use, and we were trying to keep the existing courtroom that's off to the right hand side as intact as possible. So you can see it's sort of quite cellular in its nature, and then on the left hand side, where there were less heritage elements, we were able to strip that all out to create a nice flexible open plan office. And what we were also able to do is there was an old 1990s extension to the rear that was all sort of all over the show. So what we were able to do is to clear that out and to create these two courtyard spaces that just helps to introduce a little bit of nature and outdoor space that the sort of office users can use and enjoy on a really relatively constrained site. And then what we did is we created used the central staircase to access the upper floors. That was then also used for residential purposes. And one of the other key constraints of the site is obviously in these heritage buildings where you are intervening is trying to ensure that you allow for wheelchair access. That's one of the things that wasn't particularly considered in a lot of these heritage buildings, but in order to ensure that they have a long extended lifespan, we feel that it's really important that you address these issues, these contemporary issues. So you can see as we come up to the top floors, we've got a little bit sort of more cellular as you come up to the top floors, and what we were able to do is work within the existing primary wall structure, and to insert these apartments. That meant that the divisions of the existing building were largely maintained. And then one of the more exciting spaces is we've got another courtroom up on the first floor, and so the approach that we took there was to try and create a box within a box, which I'll elaborate on in a second. And then coming up to the top floor. So this is where we added the additional massing, and I'll elaborate on the design of that in a couple of slides' time. So here you can get a sense of what we were trying to do with the extending the stair up to the third floor. So the idea behind it was to try and create an intervention where you didn't necessarily know if it was part of the new or either the existing building. So what we did is we took the elements, we worked really closely with heritage officers, and we took these heritage elements so this is the existing heritage elements. We then extended them up to the second floor and relocated the existing skylight. So what you end up with is a sort of replica of some of the elements as the building gets higher and higher. And here you can see this is that apartment that I was talking about where we've created a box within a box, and what that then allowed us to do is to keep the existing fabric of that room largely untouched, and all the sort of living elements of that apartment. You then end up inside this box. You end up with the sort of bedrooms and bathrooms that require enclosure there at the lower level, and then you end up with a sort of open platform area at the first floor. That then just means that we don't have to build walls up to the underside of those coffered ceilings that are really quite distinct and quite fabulous in the space. So here you can see an elevation of the existing building with the proposed extension on top. And the aspiration behind designing this proposed extension was that if you sort of squinted your eyes, you didn't necessarily know if this new extension was part of the original design. But then if you look a little bit closer, you understand that it is actually distinctly contemporary, but is extremely sympathetic to its existing context it finds itself. And then you can see towards the rear, we've got these sort of large semicircular windows, and then we start replicating those in some of the new windows that we are putting in towards the rear. So in terms of the design evolution, I mean, you essentially started off where I guess most architects start off with a glass box on top, and that felt like it wasn't particularly sensitive to the existing building. It very much sort of drew the attention. So we then started adding more and more solidity to that element as we went. And eventually we ended up with a sort of bottom right-hand image where you end up with sort of windows, there's quite a lot of solidity, but then sort of grouping them into a rhythm and a proportion that is sympathetic to that existing lower two floors. So you can see there's a sort of forensic understanding of the existing building that then allows us to incorporate a little bit of subtle detailing that identifies the new building as having an element of sort of decoration, but is distinctly contemporary. And then just bringing us back to that existing CGI of the building, so you can get a sense of that that extension on top of the existing courthouse. So I think in terms of the design, the context was very much governed by the existing building, and sort of all design decisions were made in response to that existing building that had found itself. And a lot of the intervention was internal, so I think that sort of meant that everything had to respond, obviously, to those internally listed elements to the building. And I think the exciting thing about this is it obviously takes an existing built element and extends the lifespan of it, because there's nothing wrong with the building. It's actually a sort of beautiful, lovely building. By introducing the sort of mixed use into that building, it obviously gives it a lifespan, sort of extends the sort of lifespan exponentially to something that was very much in 2017 redundant and at the end of its life. I'm going to hand over to Tom to go through Bishop's Terrace now.
So before we get to that, let's just see if there are any questions on the scheme we've just been looking at, Cleaver Street. Lynette, do you want to pop on your mic?
Hi, Adam. Yeah, and I was just wondering where the project's at the moment in terms of, you know, has the building been vacant for a number of years, and is it about to be built, this extension?
It's about to be submitted for planning, hopefully soon. And it has, at the moment, it's got a meantime use. There's some artists that have set up some temporary accommodation in there. It was actually the headquarters of Extinction Rebellion for a couple of weeks, I believe. So that's a sort of fairly exciting meantime use. But at the moment, it is artist studios, temporary artist studios.
What's taken so long? Why has it not been able to happen more quickly?
There's been a very complicated client development manager role relationship, and that has just meant that things have just been very slow. I think also when we initially started the project, it wasn't listed. It then became listed halfway through the project when the initial planning application had been made. So we had to then adjust the design to suit. I mean, I think what's exciting about it is actually we feel that the changes in the design as a result of the listing have actually improved the end outcome. So I think in the sense, working really closely with heritage consultants, heritage bodies and planners, it has actually enhanced the entire process towards something that we're extremely proud of now.
Thanks. I can see there's another question there.
So Emma Mumby, do you want to pop your mic on?
I've just been on the planning portal for Lambeth, and I believe that there is a planning application in at the moment. Is that the one where, yeah, not sure, it's not determined. So is that the one that was submitted before?
There was one submitted and then withdrawn, and then there was another one that's been submitted, but we've had a couple of things that we needed to clarify again. That was the point that I was making about the sort of slightly complex relationship with the client, and them slightly being in limbo with the sort of final decision of what they're wanting to pursue in terms of doing what they want to do with the building.
I'm curious about the courtrooms. From the plan that you showed, which were the rooms that were the courtrooms? There's one upstairs, there's one at the back, but there must be courtrooms at the front. You're talking they didn't have so much heritage on one side. Just take us through a bit of that. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, sure. If I just pull up a plan, it's probably going to be the best thing. So both the courtrooms are actually, so we've got Cleaver Street along the bottom of the page here. The one courtroom is, so both the courtrooms pushed away from the street. I assume that was to not be in the public eye. So they both located towards the rear of the property. So both of those courtrooms are the ones with those big arched windows.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can see that this one on the left-hand side of the first floor, and then on the right-hand, and then on the first floor goes to the left-hand side. So you got the sort of stepping of these courtrooms.
Interesting. So because initially when you look at it from the front, you assume that the windows must be double height courtroom windows, if you see what I mean. So it's really convenient for you to have that problem with all the floor in there.
Yes, yeah, that is right. Yeah, you would expect those courtrooms to be the sort of public-facing elements, but I assume obviously there was very sensitive things being discussed, and I assume that's also why one of the courtrooms was on the first floor, just to try and elevate it, take it out of that public eye. So all along the front, these were this was the judge's chamber, and they had a little sort of back passage through into the courtroom over there. So all of the elements along the street, those were all offices. And admin staff.
One of the things that, sorry, just to jump in, but I guess with a building like this, you sort of presume when you first look at it on plan, it looks like it's a kind of very symmetrical symmetrical layout. And I think what we realized quite quickly, particularly because we were talking about trying to put extra height on top, was because you've got those two large volume courtrooms, but they're on different floors, actually as a building that you had to really look at in section to understand what it was that you could do to it and what the limitations were. I think that sort of realizing that kind of helped us to unlock kind of how we could maximize the volumes of those spaces and how we could add height sensitively.
Suzanne, you've got a question. Suzanne Taylor.
Thank you. Yes, thanks. I was really interested in the box in a box idea. I see there's a question's popped up about ventilation, but I had a sort of query about how it worked in terms of sort of residential amenity, because if I was reading it right, it looks as though the kind of living space, the living room areas are kind of open.
That's right, yeah.
So is there any sort of house sort of soundproofing, or is there any thought about how that works?
Yes, I think so. This apartment is a single apartment, so it is a box within a box. But these are all bedrooms that are all part of the same apartment. So they're all on ground floor. They're able to be acoustically sealed from the upper living space. If I go to the section over here, so you're able. That's a sort of glass partition here. So this bedroom is then acoustically sealed off from the upper open plan living area. What we also had, and it's not shown on that plan, is you've got a little doorway through there that took you up to a roof terrace that was actually on top of this apartment. So if I go to this plan here, you can see the staircase coming up here, and that takes you to a roof terrace that sits on top of that courtroom apartment. And then I think I can also address the Sarah's question about ventilation in the box. We had these opening roof lights that help to address cross ventilation, and we also were replacing these existing windows with new automatic opening windows.
Sarah, you've now put your hand up as well as putting the question in the chat. Pop your mic on and ask what your question is.
Maybe I'm being a little bit dense. I understand that the space is ventilated. I'm wondering how you deal with the ventilation of the bedrooms if they're inside glass boxes.
Yeah, sure. So they have, I mean, these are sliding doors. So if you imagine that the sort of outside space, like a winter garden.
Oh, okay. So they're not fixed.
No, they're not fixed. Yeah, so you're able to open up the space completely. We did also have a little bit of, we have got some mechanical ventilation to the bathrooms. So obviously that would be more fixed. And that's then, we had a little bridging element at a low level under the floor there.
Yeah. No, it looks very clever. It was very interesting. I was just curious as to how that box works. But if they're sliding doors, that makes sense.
Good question, yeah.
And I'm curious about all this too. In terms of the top floor where you've got the living space, presumably the kitchen's up there too. Is the kitchen enclosed so that the whole space doesn't get smells of your fish and your onions?
It isn't enclosed, no. But what we were looking at is extract that's able to come from the bottom, suck from the bottom. There's all sorts of various mechanical solutions that do sort of things slightly outside of the box. But yeah,
outside of the box for the
exactly
box.
For the box inside the box. Yeah,
And so looking at what someone else was talking to, I'm sure somebody's raised the business of noise. So you've got upstairs, the kitchen and the living room. You will be able to hear what's going on in the other room from one another. It's effectively open plan, even though it may not.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. And we've got a question, Christina. Do you want to ask your question?
I was just wondering how the fire escape works in a glass box, because I know there are quite tight regulations, and I've had this in the past where I've dealt with conversions of large open space and compartmentalization.
Yes, I don't think. I mean, we work very closely, obviously, with the fire engineer. We have got two means of escape from this this apartment. So you've got your sort of main entrance door that you're able to escape out of on the lower portion of that apartment. So you come out to this door and then you come down the main stairwell. You've also then got this escape route that you can come up these stairs out and escape over this roof terrace if your means of escape does become blocked on the lower level of the apartment. I
think it's a really great solution to not putting a floor across the middle of those lovely windows. I think it's really imaginative, and I would never have thought of it. So that's why we have these sessions, to introduce ideas we'd never have thought of, and to allow us picky planners to talk about all these things you get into when you're a planner. So any more questions on this scheme?
I think the valuable thing is that they are all sort of small elements, but they all contribute to, they can fundamentally put a full stop to an idea if they're not carefully considered. So
no, it's great, and it's lovely that you can answer them all and keep us all very happy. So in which case, I'm going to agenda something else. So let's now move on to Tom.
Thank you very much. I will pull up my screen to talk about the next project. So my name's Tom Bulmer. I'm one of the associates here at Fathom. I've been here slightly less than Adam, whatever that is now, about 8 years. Before I came here, I had probably more of a background in residential architecture, residential and sort of estate regeneration, mainly in London. And then at Fathom, that's broadened out to cover all sorts of things with a bit more sort of workplace design, but still pieces of residential design, such as the one that we're going to talk about now. So this is our scheme in Bishop's Terrace, not far from where we just were in Cleaver Street. So this also in Lambeth, just over the boundary from Southwark. And it's a scheme that we were working on since 2019 for a client called the Walcot Foundation, who are a Lambeth charity who, as it says there, work to break cycles of deprivation in the borough. So they hold quite a lot of property in the area, and they use it to generate income to then distribute around the local area. So this is a site that they have held for quite some time. It's a garage site, sort of a backland garage site. It's an area that was bombed during the war. We're just behind the main road, so we've got Kennington Road running just left to right at the top of the screen, but then kind of immediately back from that quite busy thoroughfare, we've got the conservation area that we're in here, which is lots of sort of mid-19th century terraced houses of various sort of varying scale. Some of them are quite modest, some of them are a little bit grander, but they form this lovely characterful area. And the garage site, I think goodness knows how many years, but it's been sort of in its current state. It is used, but it's it's clearly not kind of bringing in huge amounts of income for the charity. So they approached us 2019 to look at development opportunities. They had previously worked up some schemes that had put forward proposals for a new terrace, a new short terrace of houses, and I think for various reasons, including sort of viability in terms of it didn't deliver many houses, and also I think there are issues around flood risk. and that scheme didn't proceed. So they came to us looking for some new ideas. This is a view from St Mary's Gardens, which is that sort of large blob of green that's on this page, bottom of the page. So we're standing on the corner there looking with Kennington Road behind these properties. So this substation is kind of the corner of the plot. So a lovely, lovely outlook for across the conservation area. But you can see kind of the interesting built character that we've got here, because although it's predominantly residential, once you get behind Kennington Road, you have got a few interesting elements of sort of commercial, these sort of former warehousing units that are now in office use. There's also this property behind these gates, which are in the ownership of the foundation, and that's also in commercial use. That's actually another firm of architects. And then you've got the backs of the houses behind, and then the carriages return round this corner. It's quite interesting to sort of look at the street grain, because in looking back at this in hindsight, I think it was quite important to kind of how we tackled the design of it. You've got these kind of interesting geometry of streets laid out, which creates quite a lot of if I flick on some site photos, there's quite a lot of, because the streets I guess are relatively short, you've got quite a lot of kind of gable ends and changes of scale and glimpses across the across the townscape, and then you get the sort of the anomalies like this sort of warehousing block that kind of pop up and create different characteristics, and then you've got the nature of the terraces again, with their slight variations in how they've been laid out and how they've been articulated, and again little nice corner details, like these old shop fronts on the corner that we were keen to sort of take inspiration from. So the way that we tackled the site was in part defined by wanting to present sort of a new edge to this kind of aspect, this outlook on across St Mary's Gardens, and also it was driven by what was happening towards the back of the site, which was this large tree, which is a protected tree right on the boundary with some neighbouring gardens. It's a tree of heaven. I can't remember the proper name for it, but I'm told it is a tree of hell because it shoots up. Shoots kind of through concrete. It's kind of like Japanese knotweed in the way that it's invasive. So client was very unhappy that was something that we weren't able to address, so that we were in fact going to be designing around. But I think the first opportunity, when that does die a death, it won't be getting replanted with the same species. But it's a very large tree. You can see it in that previous photograph, which so it had a real impact on how we were able to tackle the site layout. So conceptually, we were looking at sort of an L shape of development, which reinforced the street frontage, giving some thought to how we address this prominent corner to improve on that existing outlook with the substation, and then kind of utilising that space to the rear of the site to lay out kind of amenity space for tenants, and that sort of naturally gave us a good separation from the backs of the properties adjacent to us. And we were looking at to kind of deliver the amount of development that was felt that was needed to unlock the kind of development viability. We were looking at apartments that also suits, because the client holds on to them and lets them out. That sort of suited their, the way that they, the local market for for that type of accommodation was kind of well suited to this approach. So the way that we laid out the building was to, on the long edge, if you like, to try and present characteristics which complemented the typical terrace character. We wanted to make sure we had some activation on that frontage, so we've got a couple of kind of duplex units which are accessed directly off the street, and then having a separate entrance for the upper floor apartments. And we also had on the corner, if you like, or on this return leg, a workplace unit, which is a kind of acting as a buffer then to the other commercial units adjacent to us. So you got one off of this shared forecourt, and then you've got the warehouse sort of just off the page further south. And that was giving us kind of activity on that corner, but transitioning quite well to, you know, the more characteristic residential nature, which sits better with the surrounding context. And then we've got this courtyard, rear courtyard space, you can see defined by the tree canopy and the root protection area. And we also had to relocate the substation, which I think probably got tried out in lots of different places before being located here. And then on the upper floors, I think there's very little repetition because of the way that, as you'll see on the next slide, the building massing kind of transitions and steps. There's not much repetition in the building. It kind of pulls back as you go up away from the boundaries, and we kind of embraced that to generate amenity spaces, which were designed to avoid kind of being overly overbearing or too much overlooking of the adjacent kind of back gardens. So we've kind of designed them almost as sort of courtyards, like walled gardens. So they're kind of relatively inward looking, just to kind of try to negate that relationship. So most of the apartments are sort of, I think there's one and two beds with, I think there's one larger apartment. They're all dual and triple aspect, which one of the advantages of this, you know, one of the constraints of not being able to have, you know, a large block, it's ended up being quite shallow plan, but actually that means that all of the apartments are sort of dual or triple aspect. We've got a lift towards the centre of the core. I think we have one wheelchair unit in here. So you can see this sort of 3D view in out the back of the building. There's that tree, and you can see these kind of courtyards that we've created, courtyard terraces, which limit that outlook in the most sensitive directions. So they're kind of giving angled views, and it's stepping in and stepping up as we go upwards. So it's four-story building, which was kind of really justified by the adjacency of that warehouse and the taller terraces in the closest adjacency compared to some of the other ones which are a bit lower. If I click on this, it might make your eyes go funny, so apologies. In kind of developing our approach to how the facades were articulated, we kind of had a look at how all the surrounding context did that. So there's obviously a common pattern of brickwork in London stock, but then when you start looking at the differences between the different streets, you've got some which remain relatively unadorned, and then you've got others that have got much more in the way of kind of decorative stucco work and kind of window framing details and painted lintels and cornices and those sorts of things. And then you've got a slightly different language with the warehouse, where you've got the kind of the robust engineering brick forming a plinth. So we were kind of keen to draw on these things when developing our approach to the facades of our proposed building. This is a little bit different to where you'll see we land on the 3D on the visualization, but this shows that we've, on the left hand side where we've got the entrance on the corner to the workspace unit, we've kind of used the colouring of the engineering brick to tie it into that more commercial use, if you like. And then around to the right hand side where we've got the duplex units with their own front doors, we've got that band of lighter render or stucco work at the base, which ties it to the residential terraces. And then at the transition of the two, where you've got the communal entrance to the apartments, we sort of increased the scale of that rendered area to sort of draw attention to it as a focal point. We picked up on because we didn't have much space to set things back in terms of, because we couldn't, the tree was kind of constraining us from the front. We couldn't have a huge amount of articulation in the facade. So areas that we might traditionally have pushed back by a couple of meters to create a terrace on the top floor, is actually weren't able to do that without losing huge amounts of space. So we worked quite hard to kind of articulate the different elements of the building to tie it into the scale of the adjacent terraces. So we've got this cornice band which picked up on the 3-story scale of the terraces to the north, which then is broken by the circulation on the staircase, and then the next volume, which is at the 4-story scale, picking up on the height of the warehouses, has that different cornice band. So we're working quite hard within a relatively constrained sort of plane, if you like. And then in the articulation of the windows, whilst wanting to work proportionally with what we find in the surrounding area, we also wanted to kind of pitch this firmly in the contemporary language. So we focused on things like the lintel details to introduce depth into the brickwork, get an interesting play on light, but again, still working with the materiality of the brick rather than introducing new things, new bells and whistles. This is a view just looking at the concept of those amenity spaces for each of the apartments and why each of them sort of slightly different on different floors. So yeah, kind of reinforcing that point about directing the views kind of in this instance to the left and to the right rather than up the page, which is where the closest sensitivity was to the backs of the neighbouring properties. And then, because this being Lambeth and in a conservation area with a very vocal local population, it did go through quite a lot of iterations with the planners. I think we started off with good buy-in to the concept of what we were doing. But as we went through into more and more detail, there were elements that we found that we needed to row back on. So you can see here from a kind of materiality point of view, actually that upper floor bulk did get pitched into a different language in the end. And we did, it's probably not that evident, but at this end of the building to the right hand side, we did lose a chunk of mass because it was felt that despite the kind of various sort of daylight, sunlight, and providing lots of views of what the relationship was, it was felt that this relationship to these houses was too tight. So we ended up losing this this element of mass as well. And then one final change that was made was that the ground floor workplace unit, despite actually during early discussions with the officers, that being kind of supported in its as that kind of buffer zone between the different uses, actually they were more concerned with introducing commercial use outside of the I forget the terminology, but kind of strategically kind of allocated land use. So actually what ended up happening with the final consented scheme is that that ground floor wing all got moved into the residential functions. It's got the cycle store in it, which freed up a bit of space in the courtyard. It's got the plant space in it. We did try and see if it could be utilised for actual residential space itself, but because it's landlocked to the south, basically it's very hard to get any kind of daylight in there. So yeah, it's all kind of essentially in back of house uses. But what that has meant is that now that that corner outlook, if you like, is the common residential entrance, which feels like quite a nice outcome actually. And we don't have that duplication of entrances. Kind of we don't have one here anymore. So that kind of shows how the evolution of a scheme can go through the through the pre-application process. So yeah, it's fully consented, has been for a couple of years, I think, and it's waiting for the foundation to work out how best to proceed.
Excellent. You stopped talking, and so I'm assuming you've done.
Sorry, yes. That's me.
Really fascinating, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to actually get into this in quite a bit of detail, and for you to share how you thought this and then in the end that, which is always the interesting thing. You begin something and then for some reason things shift and it evolves. You said you started this in 2019. How long did it actually take you to get planning permission?
So I think the permission was, I think it was about 2 years ago now. It had, at first it was moving
5 years to get permission on the site.
Yeah.
Your instinct as to why was that? Those bloody people called planners getting in the way?
Well, I think it wasn't the smoothest process with Lambeth. Like I say, it started off quite well, and we had good input from quite senior design officers. And then I guess as you do get into the detail, more things do get picked at, and policy gets picked at in a bit more detail, and differing views emerge, and officers move on. That's one of our kind of common problems, I think, kind of lack of continuity. And then I guess in an area like this, there are quite a lot of well-informed local people with time on their hands who do like to get involved. That's not to say that obviously a lot of their kind of comments aren't relevant, but you're more, I guess it's that you kind of expect that if you're proposing 200 homes across 30-story tower block, but you almost get the same level of interaction across this scale, a relatively small scheme, which you'd like to think it's a block of garages, you're putting resi back in, on the face of it you'd hope it wouldn't be quite so controversial, but
I'm very aware of the time, but what were the sorts of issues that the residents were raising? Just out of interest.
The principle of development at all was fundamentally one. Yeah, fundamentally.
Because I thought they'd been glad to get rid of the garages, which I would have thought would have attracted antisocial behaviour.
Yeah, I guess they didn't. I wasn't wasn't really aware of them being that problematic in this area, which I guess might have helped. And I suppose it is a relatively tightly grained site, so people are close to it, which you have to understand. But it was quite strong objection to something that you'd like to think wouldn't have been hugely controversial.
And what did you do as a practice to try to deal with that? What was your approach?
Well, we obviously had quite good. During the planning process, went through kind of a fairly significant consultation exercise to try and, I guess, in the first instance, you're just trying to kind of make people feel more comfortable with what it is you're doing and why, and put their kind of fears at rest. But there were changes that were made as a response to that, and I guess the jiggling at ground floor was probably part of that, because even there's a front door, you can't really see it here, there's a front door around the corner from this existing block of gable terraces, and our proposed front door for the communal entrance before we moved it would have been right opposite, and even that those particular occupants didn't like being in such close proximity to people coming and going. I think the massing change at the north end was that did make quite a big difference, because it wasn't just the proximity to those houses you can see at the end there with the pitch roof, but also the gardens across the street. That did make quite a big difference in the end.
Interesting. All right, well, I mustn't hog this. Lynette, you've got another question.
Yes, I just wrote in the chat. So the height, did it require a lift, and is that something that helped determine the height, or was there other sort of design reasons that you went for that?
It's quite a long. We never looked taller than this, from what I recall. We always felt like this was a height that we felt we could justify. It has got a lift. This was all pre any formal changes to Grenfell, because I think 11 meters kicked in in terms of anything above that now, introducing sprinklers. But yeah, this was kind of felt to be something that was ticking the boxes from, it was delivering the amount of development that got to where it needed to be from a viability point of view. I think officers and tenant and local people were a little bit suspicious with that magic number of 9, or being under the number that triggers a major application, and wheelchair housing and all those sorts of things. But actually, we kicked it around quite a lot, and there was never really, without putting a whole extra floor on, it was never really going to be more than that. So yeah.
And Christina, you had a question about the bin bike storage.
Oh yeah, I would like to know how that was accommodated. I might have missed it because I had to jump on a call. And the reason I'm asking it is because I've come back from Vienna 2 weeks ago, where I've stayed with a friend who lives in, well, central Vienna. Vienna is quite small in comparison to London. And what amazed me is the main entrance looked really lovely, grand, well lit. And on each side of the entrance, there were 2 rooms with high-level windows on the main street. Each room was dedicated. One was for bike storage, secure bike storage. So you go into this main entrance and there is a room which is lockable, passcode that you can enter and get your bike. And another room on the opposite side is a bin storage, recycle bins, and everything is clearly marked. They're unashamed about it. It's a main street frontage, and you have these 2 rooms dedicated at the ground floor, each side of the entrance, to the bin storage and bike storage. And I wondered how did you resolve this in this scheme? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. That was one of the benefits of the change with the removal of that commercial unit, because actually in the end, originally we were looking at whether it was accessed essentially to that rear courtyard, to that north end. But actually we were able to reposition things because we got the benefit of this kind of existing forecourt shared with the neighbouring property. We're actually able to utilize that to open the bins and bike stores off of there. So you've kind of got, it's not right on the street, but it's kind of in a much more accessible location as well. So yeah, that was probably one of the benefits of freeing up some of that ground floor space.
Really, really good. I love the detail. Right, so we need to move on. Rebecca, take us up to Cheshire, please. Thank you, Tom.
Pleasure.
Share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, so a little bit of background before I jump into Daresbury and Cheshire. So we first started off working at RAL, so the Rutherford Laboratory in Oxfordshire, for the Science and Technology Funding Council, on basically where Diamond Light and Synchrotron is, and the whole area within the security fence up at RAL. And we were asked to look at doing a development plan. So we teamed up as part of our collaboration process with David Locke Associates, who are urban designers and master planners. We've worked with them an awful lot. We have a long-running relationship, and so they bring more of the landscaping urban design side of things together, and we come from more of an architectural point of view, with heights, massing, design, appearance, those kind of things. But we work really closely, actually sitting around a table, scribbling out layouts and things together and bouncing those ideas. And it's a really good way of bringing fresh ideas to master planning. So we were asked to do a development plan, which was slightly different to a master plan. And it was basically taking areas of scientific importance with multiple buildings, and working out how you could create more of a sense of place, more of a master plan, make them more user-friendly, because by nature a lot of these buildings, and you can see the Daresbury up on site, it's grown up over the years ad hoc as to when they get funding for a particular experiment, and sometimes that funding is allocated in the north, down south. It's a little bit ad hoc as how it goes. You also get funding for your building, and normally you're building only. So the way that the sites are developed, the spaces in between, how you move, how you walk around, where the car parking goes, is almost an afterthought, and it's very hard as an estate to manage that over long term. So the development plans are basically the equivalent of a master plan, but taking each building by building, each plot by plot, and I'll explain that a little bit more as we go through, and looking at more of a sequence of interventions of, if you did that there, you couldn't do this, or if you need to do that, you also need to contribute to a little bit of this placemaking. So it helps set out a route to how you might improve these things. So we work through the development plans, and then sometimes they get turned into SPGs that can be used, or we at least go to the planners. And so at RAL and Daresbury, we have a public facing document that we've presented that's shown, and we get buy-in from the planners on the principles of the heights, the massing, the potential plots, the routes and everything, so that when the individual buildings come through to go needing to funding and applications, the conversations around the bigger picture have already happened. So jumping into Daresbury, which is a slightly smaller version because it's easier to talk about, we are up in the north near Runcorn. It was originally set up in about the 1970s. There is a very large experimental chamber. It's got a massive 100-metre concrete tower that was built on a temporary planning application for one experiment, and it's currently been there quite a long time, obviously not that temporary, and has now become a bit of an icon on the landscape, which we'll come on to in a little bit, because it's raised the question of, should it be listed, shouldn't it? And if it is, what do you use it for? Because it's built for an incredibly specific experiment that is no longer used. And then behind that, you've got what's called a synchrotron. So we're finding particles round. They're built in huge amounts of concrete under the ground, and lots of beam lines and experimental chambers and halls that sit around it. You then have all the types of scientific buildings going on, which are much more kind of labs or workshops. And the way that the science is kind of developing is there's a lot more computer data driven, slightly less wet lab, and so the range of buildings that you get on these sites changes. What also happens is you get other companies, as well as alongside STFC, building their own kind of incubator spaces next to it and adjacent. So where you can see my cursor, this is actually buildings by other people outside of their site, but it helps to develop that community. Now, one of the interesting things at Daresbury is always security lines with anything to do with scientific buildings. At RAL, for example, there is a massive security fence and everything that's inside it is protected. One of the lovely things about Daresbury is it opens. The buildings individually deal with security on their own front door, and you can walk through, which is wonderful because we're in an area of great beauty. There is an amazing canal that runs across one edge of it. There is a hill and a woodland walk, and you can therefore draw on all of those things to try and get people to engage a little bit more with what's happening. So just touching on a few little bits about the building and the site. One of the key drivers always with these kind of developments and master plans is, and the question always crops up, where is the front door? Where is the heart of the campus? Are we trying to get everyone to interact together and create a heart in a communal building, or are we creating individual buildings and everyone disappears into them and they don't talk? And that's a big conversation that we have with multiple stakeholders at each of these places to kind of try and draw on what is it that they want to get out of it. So at Daresbury, they actually have a main reception centre, but they've got a really nice amenity building down on the canal that people use. It's just quite underloved. So the first thing we do is start by understanding the existing site, and we run through a series of layers and levels with us and David Locke Associates to understand how people move around the building, from pedestrians, from vehicles, and car parking in these places is always tricky, and it's probably one of the biggest challenges. Surface car parking tends to be used to be the predominant, but obviously it kills a lot of area and potential development land. You're also talking about large sites where people want to park near their buildings for safety at night, but by doing that, you're kind of everything becomes much more spread out. You're disencouraging kind of that interaction. So interestingly, car parking becomes a major topic as you deal with it, and where do those places go? And then on existing sites, it's also then looking at which bits of buildings can go, what's hit the end of its life. In this instance, there's quite a lot of the buildings with severe kind of asbestos and kind of derelict and need to be cleared, so we start removing those. We then look at the topography. This has got a very big slope, so these kind of zigzaggy lines indicate that there's quite a level change, which means we've got some great views out across the site, but it also means certain buildings are quite prominent in massive kind of long distance views across the area. We then look at where are your frontages? Where do you want people to be walking and moving? Where are your front doors? Where are your back doors? And we build up these layers to give kind of a fix, as we call it, on really understanding what the existing is. That then enables us to kind of unpick it and start creating the similar kind of layers over the top of what's existing with the new. So these are just a few of examples. I don't want to go through absolutely everything, or we'll be here all day. But we start looking at where the canals were, where the main spine is for visitors, where the fronts of the buildings are, and how we might change these to create pockets of green space in between. How do you change where the front doors are of those buildings so that they face each other and you become clusters? We then also start looking at which of the buildings could be the amenity buildings. So where do you put the main amenity building? Where would you have your heart? And we sometimes do that by actually getting the heads of quite a lot of the buildings, or heads of a lot of the estates, to sit down, post-it notes in a meeting room, and actually make them all, where would you want the heart of your building to be? And the heart of your campus might not be your front door, and very rarely is. And that's a quite distinction. So on this one, actually came back being the main heart of the building needs to be near the canal. It's where we all want to go. It's it can be seen from ages. It's where we want to spend. It's where we want our canteen, our restaurants, our lecture theatres. So let's put it there. But then where we actually have car parking and visitors and other things, we need a few more scattered kind of mini hearts, as we call them, or amenity buildings along that main approach. We then work through and look at what all the plots are, and we start carving up each of the plots into specific kind of buildings. Some of those remain as existing, and others we kind of label up, and we go into each one of these in a lot more detail as to what you might do. Some will be, they've already secured planning for a quantum computing centre that has to go there, that's already under construction. Others are, we think we've got funding for this building here, but it might go there, it might go there. Tell us where you think it's best to go. So it's trying to be a little bit more strategic in where you place things and how you place things, and help them manage future developments. So talking through a little bit about what we ended up doing, we have the main kind of spider road that comes off the roundabout and motorway that runs along the side of Daresbury. Off this, we kind of pulled in and we created a new multi-storey car park, which was to house up to 850 people, but right off the road, right at the front, and tried to therefore move all surface car parking that wasn't disabled or goods away. Luckily, Daresbury is not well, and you can walk it. It's slightly tricky, but the other things of integrating cycle facilities, other means of active kind of transport around the estate. They've been looking at automated vehicles and little buses that can take people around, and basically trying to get cars out of the estate. The other key thing is looking at where do you put goods goods in, goods out. In science campuses, there is always lots of very large vehicles, lots of gas coming in, safety reasons, and where you locate that is quite critical. So again, we tucked it straight off the main road so that you're not dealing with bringing all of those things in individually, and then each of the buildings kind of go and collect what they need as and when they need it. So you're avoiding bringing large trucks into the site, and you're trying to make it much more of a friendly process. The next thing we try and look at is, can we create a loop or multiple loops of circulation around, so that there's a bit of a consistency of how you travel around the estate, rather than just higgledy-piggledy, everyone gets to a different building. So it becomes a little bit more logical of how you follow around. So there was a large synchrotron here that we were able to get rid of certain buildings. So we started to create just slightly more linear plots and buildings. Everything in white is existing buildings, and they were staying. We then looked at creating this new square down on the canal frontage and actually integrating more countryside walks, more biodiversity, more planting along all of those canals to get the routes round. Those are the kind of things, by putting them into a development plan early, STFC can get on whenever they've got extra funding. They're starting to pre-plant things ahead of planning applications come in. We obviously know that if you want to really establish an area of beauty or trees or woodlands, it takes years to get that underway. And we don't necessarily need to wait for every individual building to start doing those. You can kind of bank your biodiversity credits in some ways ahead of time, and that actually has real benefits for the long-term kind of environment. So we kind of work up a layer of plans. We then strip them back a little bit to make them a little bit more public friendly and facing. There's quite a lot of stuff in these plans that I can't talk about because of the sensitive nature of what goes on in these buildings, but it gives a kind of idea. Then off the back of this is probably a little bit easier for you to understand, jumping out of plan world and into a little bit of 3D. We start looking at appropriate massing and massing of these buildings and plots. So we work with the existing. So on the top left, you can kind of see all the existing building heights. They're 3-4 stories maximum at one point. You tend to have quite a lot of large double height warehouse spaces that are more technical and industrial. And then we obviously have an incredibly large tower at the top, and we're going up hills. So we mass these and test these, and then we work on establishing all the views and testing all the views in a proper study across this on the general massing, so that we can then go to the planners, you guys, and talk about it and get in buy-in in principle of these heights are okay, so that when the build plots come to being developed individually in the future, we've kind of set that established of, this is where your front door should kind of be, this is what the height is, the principles around it. So it's like one stage before an outline planning application, I would say. It's like that kind of first basis of the development principle. So overall in our plan, we were kind of putting the large multi-storey car park and energy centres off the main road. We were then trying to create this new heart and square of our campus alongside where the current canteen and lecture theatres are, so that we weren't having to redo everything, and really trying to integrate this new canal-sized walk and pockets of space. This also enabled the public. There was a footpath that goes along the edge up to these woodlands that people used a lot, but at the moment it was very hard to navigate with a lot of scientific buildings in the way. So we created loops and better signage to make sure that people could keep using those. Off the back of that, we then go building by building and look at a series of feasibilities for STFC on what could you do. So working on buildings that might be possible to retrofit or refurb or extend, rather than just key demolition. So we take each of the buildings. This is just a couple of examples, looking at, say, for example, this was block A. Can we build out to the side? Is that suitable for labs? Could you build up and get an extra couple of floors on? What's the maximum we think you could do on the site? And then off that, they can run financial appraisals on each of them, which they did. And it gives them kind of a baseline case study for, actually, we think if someone wants to do a certain experiment and take this building, we should be pushing them to do this amount of development because that'll give us a certain amount of space that we need on the site. Part of the issue with when the funding comes into place on these kind of buildings is you only build what you've got funding for. So if your funding comes in and you only need 2 stories, you only build 2 stories, you could potentially have gone up to 4. So part of this is trying to give them the joined up thinking of, well, actually, can we get the base build funding in to do that extra floors just as kind of shell, and someone else can come in and fit out when they've got more funding. Off that, we basically create kind of, as we call them, little plot passports and feasibility studies on each building. We produce an accompanying design guide that goes with it, that kind of covers more of the aesthetic nature. We'll go into, with David Locke Associates, the different types of open spaces, their character. Is it a natural kind of character? Is it a cluster for front doors? Is it where vehicles are? We'll specify the exact widths of the roads and those kind of things. And then we go into a little bit more detail in terms of the appearance of the buildings. And one of the things, having worked on lab buildings and science campuses for quite a long time, is we've worked out that they tend to come in 2 forms, as we call them. Heads and tails, which is this diagram down to the left, where actually you need the front door and head of a building that needs to be high quality, and it's mainly where the office element is, it's where your front doors is, it's where you spend the money on the facades. And the tail is actually, could be more shed-like. It's the bit where the experiments, it needs to be able to change and be tweaked, and understanding those kind of relationships enables us to work out how do you position them on the site where they come. The other analogy we use is kind of farmhouse and sheds. So you might have a heart of a building in a campus, and there's some examples where you've like Bedbrook Science Park is a very much a farmhouse and a shed kind of environment, where one building provides all the amenity, and there's a scattering of those kind of low cost, kind of more tech boxes that enable them to do the experiments around. And understanding that also gives you different characters in terms of appearance. So we set 3 different kind of characters in terms of in the design code. So as we call them, the fronts and the heads of the buildings, and there's just a few kind of key items of it. It should be warmer in tone, they should be textured, they need to be more have a 3D element to them, they need to have their front door. We have the rears of the building, which much more need to be, they can be simple, they need to be more flexible, they need to be more robust. And then we have amenity focused buildings, which are kind of more of that, need to be glazed, have a relationship to their spaces. And we assign the characters of each of these buildings to the plots, or to the fronts of the plots and the back of the plots as to where they are. Alongside that, we then give some precedents of what those characters might be. So just taking one, this kind of goes through actually the fronts of the buildings, the row at the top of the images, there are the existing buildings, this is what they currently look like, and actually these are some precedents of how we think other science buildings have done that really well, as an idea of how you might take it. So we're not telling them the exact materiality of what it has to be, or the design, but we're giving an idea and setting a few rules in place. Depending on the development plan, we might take that a lot further, or we might pare it back, and that just depends on what the clients have asked us to do. So yeah, so it's a very different thing for a building in kind of more of a development plan and overall, but it's how we approach those kind of slightly more large scale master planning and tackle some of the issues that lots of different people face, especially in the science and research technology, of funding, ownership, historic estates that then need to be kind of reworked and rejiggled to make them more user-friendly environment.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And again, really fascinating to follow your thought process. And it's what we do as planners, as architects, as people working in the built environment. You're constantly trying to evolve things and make sure that it's hanging together as a whole. And to have an opportunity to plan that for a campus and to do that thinking in advance is really great. I've got a question which is about, you mentioned it being an SPD. And I'm curious to know how you've had the conversations with the council and they're buying into it. But you also talked, Tom talked about churning staff. What happens if the staff that are bought into it leave and then new staff don't buy into it? How have you anchored that in the local authority?
So the ones that we've done up in Oxfordshire, we've spoken, we've had several meetings, we've brought it in. They actually distribute the public facing documents to people who are going. We kind of know it's working more from the fact that we've had people saying, oh, we're working on this building and we've been given your reports as the basis. It was like, oh, great, it's good to see. It is also really tricky. If it's not actually turned into an SPG, sometimes they aren't. That continuity can disappear. I think the fact that you have a set of rules that's already been tried and tested and agreed with one person means that if the continuity at the planners does change, you've got a bit of evidence, at least a starting point and a common ground to explain why you've got to a certain place before. You've also got all the view testing done already. That's kind of already sitting with planners and you guys so that you know what you're looking for. And so the key elements have almost been agreed in principle without it becoming a full SPG. Obviously, it's very hard to turn some of these things into that because they were constantly moving. So, for example, we've just been appointed again and we're 5 years on and we're now about to do an entire refresh depending on what they've just done, which bits of them managed to implement, and then we'll be moving back up to Daresbury to do again. So it's not a static document, and I think that's also, you have to learn that we'll get back there in a few years' time and go, oh, brilliant, you managed to do this, and what happened there? Right, okay, how do we do it? And I guess that's what keeps our job exciting, that we're never quite sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the downside of having it as an SPD might be that actually then the funding situation shifts, and for some reason the client wants to do something fundamentally different, and it's all tied down in SPD. So there's swings.
Yeah, and I think it's about having those dialogues with you guys in the planning department early to test our thinking. So particularly in massing and views or anything strategic on capacity of sites, where the parking is going, where goods in, anything that really impacts how it's used, making sure that everyone's kind of bought in the principles and those building blocks underneath that then enable, when planning applications come around, a slightly easier ride, basically.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Jennifer Coppop, you've got a specific question about multi-stories. Are you on the call, Jennifer? You did ask it at 13:45. You might have now gone off to make your toast, which is all fair and acceptable. Let me ask it on your behalf. Do you have experience with demountable multi-stories to respond to potential future change in parking demand? And is this concept realistic, she asks?
It's an incredibly expensive way of doing something that's changing and demanding. You can do them as demountable. On this, we used a lot of precedents for various different ones that were kind of quite multi-story but quite open, and you can get quite a lot of greening and screening around the edges. It is always challenging, and I think multi-story car parks is one of the most divisive things, that especially existing people in buildings, they want their car parking space outside their front door of their laboratory, and trying to persuade them that for the greater kind of good, it's better to move it. They do trial them, and we have trialed a couple where they're smaller. You start off with a smaller multi-story and you can keep bolting on and adding on, so that you're gradually getting people to buy into it.
Jennifer, I see you've put your hand up. I don't know whether that was before.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm sorry, my microphone wasn't working. Yeah, parking is always the hottest topic in Oxford. And we get these proposals that say, oh yes, we have a demountable car park that can be flexible use once the demand for parking reduces, and I just don't believe it until I see it, really. And also what we're struggling with is, say you have a multi-storey car park and they propose an activated use on the ground floor along like a key connector, say. And I just don't know how successful that will be, because how do you really activate a car park? It's
It's a challenging, interesting one, I guess. So going back to my former practice life, I did look at the one of the buildings we did up in Oxford. I think it was called the Amenities Building, and it was incubator labs connected to a multi-story car park, and we positioned basically the incubator labs provided the activity at almost the head of the building, using my heads and tails analogy, and the car park was bolted on to the back, so that the public, the street facing was an activation use, if that made sense. There were kind of distinct structural kind of splits between car parking, because no car parking levels ever work with an actual lab building, and that worked quite well. It is tricky on getting kind of activation uses. You can, I think, producing decks or activities and then putting the car parking above can work, or doing it the other way round. So that you bury your car parking depending on where you are under like podium levels kind of works, but it is always tricky. I think what we ended up doing quite a lot with STFC and RAL and Daresbury was just saying, this is the car park. And in RAL, it's a much bigger site. We had 3 or 4 multi-story car parks scattered around the site at key strategic things. But we then located them quite near the amenity building. So you could come out of your car park and you go across to your amenity building, and that's where you would have your coffee or your lunch, or you might have a gym nearby. But it's a real challenge. And the amount of cars obviously hopefully will go down in the future, but you're relying on public transport upgrades, and it is really hard to predict the amount of how people use these buildings, specifically in the science sector. I think it changes so quickly as to the type of sciences that then build on these sites and locations, the amount of people that go use them, how often they go in, the frequencies can be very different. And it's a 24-hour working campus, so that's the other really interesting I think about life science campuses is experiments will run 24 hours a day on certain key buildings. So you have to imagine how these places will work at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's quite dark outside, and there's not that many people around, but there are still people leaving and going home, and that is very different to working in a commercial centre or a town centre. So it's a juggling act, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just one other point. So we're working on these previously developed sites like the science park and the business park, and the applicants don't have ownership over the whole site. So we end up with multiple multi-story car parks, as you say. Have you found in Daresbury that that's affected placemaking, or is it just something that you accept?
I think because so for Daresbury, because it's the STFC that ultimately own quite a large proportion of it, I think it's been okay. I know the buildings across the road then all have their own independent car parks, and there's not a lot we can do about that, because like you say, it is outside our ownership. I think the campuses that I've worked on have predominantly been in the control of one overriding body. So although at RAL you might have quantum computing, ISIS, EPAC, loads of different kind of very large, well-established scientific endeavours, they ultimately all sit within the same secure line by STFC. So it's a little bit easier to have some of those awkward conversations. It's not easy by any means, but there is a little bit more of a sway. Whereas on science parks that are kind of more commercial-led, developer-led, rather than being the National kind of Science and Technology Council, I'm imagining that's much harder to have those joined up conversations.
Yes.